Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin our final speech, I just want to say on behalf of the Danube Institute, thank you to everybody for coming here today, and we hope that you will join us tomorrow for our second day of our summit. It will be, coffee and registration will begin at 9:30 a.m. tomorrow, and our first discussion will begin at 10 a.m. Meanwhile, after our final speech, we will be having reception out in the gallery. But for now, I would like to begin introducing our final speaker for the day. It's my privilege to welcome Professor Frank Füredi to the stand. He will be speaking on geopolitical illiteracy of the West. Professor Füredi is Emeritus Professor of Sociology from the University of Kent, United Kingdom. Professor, thank you very much.
So it seems like I always get the graveyard shift. And my job is to make sure that you still remain alive and intact and awake by the time you leave this conference. But I want to thank the Danube Institute for putting on this incredible conference, because the issues we're discussing comes at a time when the world around us is dramatically changing, and when many of the things that we could take for granted since the end of the Cold War have suddenly been called into question. And so I think as a result, it's really timely that we dig deep, use our intellectual resources to see, are there some important insights that we can begin to extract from this experience? Now, I'm going to talk about geopolitical illiteracy. And the first time I ever encountered directly geopolitical illiteracy was on the playing fields of Canterbury, where my son was playing rugby. It's a funny sport that English people play sometimes. Well, not just English people, but I never realized it existed until I was told that your son is playing rugby. And you have to go there and watch him play. And I'm standing there, and a lot of other parents are next to me, and this guy comes up to me and is looking outraged. He's really, really angry. And he says to me, "Oh, your son is in the same class as mine, but do you know that there's a father who's a little bit skeptical of climate change?" Can you believe that? Can you really believe? And I look at him and I said, that would be me, right? That would be me. But that wasn't the end of the story. We have a conversation, civil conversation, and it turns out that he works in the Foreign Office. Now, there used to be a time when the Foreign Office was the Rolls-Royce of the British state. It has, some of the best people used to work there. So I'm talking to the guy from the Foreign Office, and suddenly I realized that although he's very high up, he doesn't speak a foreign language. He doesn't speak a word of a language that's not English. He's meant to be keeping his eye on international developments in Asia, but he could barely spell the word Asia. I think he would struggle to do that, because his education, as I later discovered, was not about diplomacy. He had no idea about history. He had no idea about philosophy or theology. I had the impression that he probably studied joint honors in social work and psychology. And yet he was high up there, and he was making, presumably, some very important decisions. And at that point I realized that something had changed. And the fact that something has changed was confirmed to me a couple of months ago when the Times reported that the Foreign Office was struggling to find people who speak Mandarin, Chinese. And if you are keeping an eye on China and you try to make sense of developments, and again, you can barely spell the word China, and you don't really understand the subtleties, the nuances of the cultural dynamics there, I don't think you're going to be very effective from the diplomatic point of view. And I can give you loads of examples of how this has occurred in many, many parts of the world, because the next time I encountered geopolitical literacy was when I went to Washington and talked to some people in the State Department. They had asked one of my colleagues to come over and talk about radicalization. Why do young kids, why do young Muslims in Britain, Holland, France become drawn towards jihadist politics? And we go there and we talk, and I meet the guy who's the FBI's head of counterterrorism, a very sweet guy, really sweet. he turned out to be, I think, a fairly young sort of operator. His main virtue from the point of view of the State Department was that he was Muslim. So that meant that he must be very good at kind of understanding this kind of problem. But when you talk to him, it was amazingly embarrassing that he knew so little about the way that the radical Islamic world was working and the way that the radicalization process occurred. So I asked him, have you ever seen a jihadist video? Because if you're going to understand radicalization process, you have to look at the videos that all the young kids were kind of looking at. And he says to me, oh, I didn't even realize they exist. And he took out a pen and he asked me for the names of videos to watch. And that kind of experience, where, in a sense, diplomats, people working in the Foreign Office, are not up to the job, is something that I've encountered in many, many occasions, not just simply in the Anglo-American world, but also in France and Holland and elsewhere. So the thing that I'm very interested in is, why is this happening? I mean, why do you have all these schmucks working in the Foreign Office and the State Department and in a number of other places? I mean, what makes them tick? And I think there are a number of reasons for it, but essentially, there are a number of interrelated themes that are a problem from the point of view of Western diplomacy. When I was a student at McGill University in the 19th century, studying international relations, we still talked about realpolitik as being something that you take really, really seriously. And we still had classes on geopolitics. Now that was then. Today, if you look at IR departments in many parts of the Anglo-American world, you'll find that, first of all, geopolitics has become a dirty word. They don't use geopolitics. And I remember when I asked, rather naively, well, why don't we use geopolitics? What's the problem there? They said the reason why we don't use geopolitics is because, it's associated with the language of the Germans in the 20s and the 30s. It's the bad old days in Europe's past, which was geopolitical. And now we've learned to leave the bad old days behind because we've become very modern and progressive. And therefore, we no longer use the word. Now, the problem is if it was simply the question of not using the word geopolitics, I could live with that. But if you stop thinking geopolitically, in other words, if the substance of geopolitics eludes you, and you kind of look at the world in that kind of Philistine and naive way, and you haven't got the intellectual resources to understand that the reason why there was a concept of geopolitics was because the relationship between nations and the conflict between nations and regions had to be understood relatively objectively, and there had to be an understanding of the historical roots of this. Unless you understand that, you're in big trouble. So to me, the first reason why we have geopolitical illiteracy is because geopolitics itself has been rejected by many, many people. In the Foreign Office, when you talk to these guys, they really come across as if they were social workers. And they talk about all the developmental projects that they've accomplished in Kenya or in Uganda. And they go on and on and on about the importance of teaching young girls how to read. I mean, they're obsessed with that. They have to teach young girls how to read, never mind young boys or anything else. They tell you about all the welfare measures that they are interested in. And they also tell you, and this is a real clue, I don't know if it's like that in America, but in England, what they are very proud about is that, we no longer have a one-dimensional understanding of diplomacy. We use all kinds of organizations to project our influence, by which they mean they use an army of NGOs. And they work through NGOs and charities. Now, NGOs and charities might do good work, but they're not going to be able to project power. They're not going to be able to defend national interests. And when that's what you do, that's what you rely on, and you think that's really the high point of your career, is to run all these NGOs, then I think we're in trouble. So geopolitics, first problem. A theme that's interlinked with it is the concept of national interest. Have you ever heard of the concept of national interest? The reason why I ask is because if you now go to a politics department, an IR department, a philosophy department, and you dare talk about the national interest, they look at you as if you're a pervert. Right? We don't talk about national interest anymore. They seriously say that we don't talk about national interest anymore because that is very selfish. There's something wrong about putting the interest of your nations before those of another nation. And you have all these books being written and monographs being written that denounce the idea of national interest. And they even have this idea there's a very clear causal connection between defending national interest and going to war. So in their simplistic worldview, if you take your nation seriously, if you uphold the interests of your nation first of all, that somehow is a marker for you unleashing these destructive, corrosive forces that have led to the bad old days of Europe. So therefore, national interest is not something you take seriously. Sometimes, very quietly, you talk about it, but it's not something you want to promote or uphold. The third element that links the third interrelated theme to geopolitics and national interest is the idea that when it comes to global relationship, the economy trumps politics. That somehow we live in a world where economic relations between different nations and economic competition is essentially going to have a harmonizing effect that will lead to political conflict becoming diminished. The most grotesque example of this is, of course, Germany, where they basically imagine that if they're going to have close economic ties with Russia or China, that's eventually going to lead to democratization in those societies. And this idea was very much summed up during the Clinton administration by that very famous quote, which they used all the time and it's never been questioned, when he said, the economy is stupid, that somehow the economy is everything. Now, I like economics, and I believe in strong economic competition, and I also recognize that economics are quite foundational in terms of the allocation of resources. But the idea that the economy as such, or economic relations as such, are going to solve fundamental political and national problems, long-standing conflicts, is really the height of naivety. And I think that these three elements were very much tied together, and somebody raised this earlier on, by the idea of globalization. And I think, as one of our speakers said, globalization is a very funny concept because it's one thing to recognize that you have the internationalization of capital, but as an ideology, globalization, the idea that somehow, we are now in a new era where we can leave behind the conflicts of the past. The theories of globalization had these mantras. First of all, they said, the nation is no longer important. All of our problems are international, they're global. Therefore, forget about giving an important role to national governments. That domestic laws need to be trumped by international laws, because that's really what's important. That cosmopolitan ideology that emerged has been extremely powerful in influencing the way that politics works, and that accounts, I think, to a great extent to the way that geopolitical ideals have diminished quite significantly. But the most important problem that's very rarely recognized, that underpins these different trends, is what I, in my book on the Ukraine, call historical amnesia. And by historical amnesia, what I mean is that there's a sense in which, particularly in Europe, we believe that we left the bad old days behind. I think the European Union has this fantasy. I don't know if you remember when they got the Nobel Prize for Peace, I think in 2012, they had this fantasy that wars on the European continent are unthinkable. It will never happen. They actually believed that wars had become obsolescent. And in fact, there were quite a lot of people that wrote books about this. The fact that wars are obsolescent, certainly conventional wars, they said, was never going to happen on the European continent. We might have a bit of asymmetric warfare, we might have a bit of Islamic terrorism, we might have fights in Africa, but yeah, on the continent itself in Europe, that's gone, that's really finished. And that was the assumption on which a lot of calculations were made by international bodies and political operators, which I think obviously was flawed. I mean, you don't have to wait for the invasion of Ukraine by Russia to understand that. We already saw that in the breakup of Yugoslavia. I mean, why did we not learn any lessons from what happened in Yugoslavia? Why was it that we've forgotten? I mean, there are many, many people who don't remember what happened in Yugoslavia. They think that was like a transient moment, a bad dream that is now overcome. They don't realize that what happened in Yugoslavia in the 1990s still leaves its imprint on the contemporary era. I mean, the very fact that we're having these to's and fro's between Serbia and Kosovo today, and that if you go to many parts of the old Yugoslav republics, the conflicts are still very, very strong and kind of, in a sense, boiling away all the time. So basically, when you have this kind of sense of historical amnesia, what you basically understand is that we have to leave the past behind. We are living in a new world where there's nothing to be learned from the past. Right? There's nothing to be learned from the past. In fact, everything in the past is outdated. And I think that concept of historical amnesia was most eloquently expressed by Francis Fukuyama. I mean, if you reread Francis Fukuyama's The End of History, and I really suggest you read it, because now it's obviously much more absurd than it was then. He has got passages in there, and it was taken, nobody challenged him on this. He basically said, we now live in a world of economic harmony, right? And he says the European Union, as a peaceful, harmonious federation, is a far better example of the future than the United States. But what he also said, that because we have economic harmony throughout the world, we no longer need, and he said this, I quote him, we no longer need military generals and statesmen. Well, I think he got his wish, right? I think he got his wish. Because statesmen are conspicuous by their absence. I mean, I look around Washington, Paris, London, and basically we have a leadership bypass. I mean, it's very rare when you meet convincing leaders who are authoritative, who are leading from the front. That doesn't really happen anymore. I mean, the closest we come to it in the West is Macron. And Macron isn't something you want to introduce to your mother because, you never know what he's going to do. He's so unpredictable in any time, any kind of month, any kind of week. He might. He's done that already. So he's got a good track record on that area. So I think I'll keep my mother away from him to some extent. Anyway, so the interesting thing is that, so if you basically say that this is the end of history, we have this new kind of beginnings, and although people criticized Fukuyama, they actually didn't criticize the substance of that, because his basic argument was that now the kind of conflicts that existed in the past are unthinkable. And I think that idea that those conflicts were unthinkable really influenced the imagination of many of our geopolitical operators. Now, why am I saying this? Why am I so excised about geopolitical illiteracy? I think the reason why I'm really concerned about it is because the flip side of geopolitical illiteracy is a concept that I discussed again in my book called the moral disarmament of the West. I think that in terms of the moral domains, the West has effectively disarmed itself. And I don't want to sound as if, like a preacher, I'm moralizing or anything of that sort, but I do think that many of the issues that we were discussing this morning in the first panel and the second panel, to do with leadership and strategy and all that stuff, are rooted in the fact that there is a kind of inability among many of our Western leaders to understand the origins of who we are and what we're about. And one of the points that we learned from history, from the Romans onwards, is that power without meaning is effective. If you cannot give meaning to your power, if you don't know what you're projecting, then it ends up just being so much physical force rather than something that can effectively change the world, make things happen. And I think that one of the things that has occurred as a result of that is that certain foundational moral values have gone. I think one of the most dangerous developments is that the military or people involved in security exist on the margins of society. You know, there was a time when good middle-class families sent one of their boys to join the army. That was a norm. There was a time when the military was respected. In England, many regiments do not allow their soldiers to wear their uniform when they go into town because they're worried about the fact that they might get beaten up or sworn at or spat at. There's a sense in which the military, both as a physical force and as an ideal, has been morally devalued to the point at which they become extremely insecure and they understand that these days things are very, very different. I remember when I was a 16-year-old kid living in Canada, I wanted to join the army, and I did join for a while. And one of the reasons why I wanted to join the army as a 16-year-old, because I was told that if you wear a uniform, you get all the girls. It wasn't true. It wasn't true, by the way, but that was the myth. Certainly wasn't true in my case. That was the myth. These days, nobody will argue that the way you become popular in England, for example, is by putting on a uniform, because that kind of relationship between society and the military has gone. But what has also gone are the moral values that are foundational for national security. And what are these moral values that have always been important? The first one is duty. You know, whenever I talk about duty in a public setting, I can see people hurling their contempt at me because they think that the only people that believe in duty are old-fashioned conservatives. I mean, the really old-fashioned dinosaur reactionaries who still think that duty is something good. And they regard duty as a drag. I mean, that's basically how they see it. The last thing I want is duty. The second thing that's gone is loyalty. Right? I mean, real loyalty. I mean, we live in a world where young people are told that unless you change your CV every couple of years, you're a loser. So you have all these kids, you know, my ex-students, and they proudly tell, you know, Frank, I've had 4 jobs already in 2 years. My CV is looking really, really good. And the idea that somehow loyalty is something that you take seriously, that you're loyal to your organization, to your family, and to your community, and to your nation, is again not taken all that seriously. The third element that's gone is courage. We used to teach children courage. I mean, when you went to school, courage was something that we thought kids had to learn in order to be able to make their way in the world. Now, in the Anglo-American world, instead of courage, we validate them. We don't criticize them, we tell them how good they are, we give them smiley faces, but we don't tell them to be courageous because that's too risky. So that particular value is gone. And it seems to me that when courage and duty and loyalty, all these things are gone, it's only a matter of time before the final value, and that of patriotism, also acquires negative connotations. How many times do you hear people proudly declare in Europe that they're patriotic? That patriotism is something that is essential for a community to survive and to reproduce itself. We live in a world where people who wave the flag are seen as people who are marginal or losers, usually the far right. Flag waving is often denounced as somehow, you know, a sign that you're going to become nationalistic and you're going to create a problem for your society. So the problem I'm really trying to get at is that when you have the erosion of these basic values that are quite willingly marginalized by our cultural institutions, by our schools, it's not surprising that we have essentially the West morally disarming. And when the West morally disarms, problems kick in. Young Muslim kids in England, when you ask them, why do you support the jihadist movement? Why do you feel more comfortable with them rather than with England? They will tell you, that's because you're giving me nothing. The British society doesn't give you any kind of values that I can hold on to. They don't make me feel at home because they're basically telling me that anything goes. I mean, that's the way they interpret it. And in a sense, what we have is a situation where a lot of these kids are attracted not because jihadist ideology is so persuasive and so beautiful, but because they feel alienated and estranged from a society that's got nothing to give them, that doesn't expect anything from them, and doesn't tell them about loyalty, duty, and all these basic foundational principles. So I want to end on what I think is the key challenge for all of us, everybody in this room. And the key challenge for us is not to accept the moral disarmament of the West, but on the contrary, we have to begin the process where we morally rearm, where we somehow find ways and means of making some of these values relevant for the 21st century, where we find ways and means of not being embarrassed about the fact that we're patriotic, but actually explain how that's a virtue rather than a source of strength rather than a source of weakness. We have to take seriously much more than we're doing the ideals that are associated with the nation state and national borders. And we have to basically get back to the point where we basically argue that rather than historical amnesia, we want to learn the lessons of history. Because a society and a culture and a civilization that has lost sight of where it's come from, where it no longer knows the origins of its culture, will never amount to anything, will lose its way in the way that we're doing at the moment. And I do get depressed by one thing in the Ukraine war, from a moral point of view, is when I see all these leaders in the kind of very narrow technical sense, managerial sense, all these leaders from Biden to Johnson to Macron going to Kiev for a photo opportunity, where basically for them the high point of gaining legitimacy and authority is cuddling Zelensky and sort of being there and saying, I got the picture, I got the t-shirt, and that's what's really all about. Because basically what they're doing is they're parasitically living off the moral heroism of the Ukrainian people. And instead of emulating their example by adopting similar approaches, they are living vicariously out of the suffering and the sacrifices of others. That's not the way to morally rearm. The way we morally rearm is that we learn the lessons of Ukraine and emulate the capacity of those people to take their nation, their independence seriously, who know that courage, loyalty, and duty are not just simply words, but they are the concept that will motivate people to acts of heroism. And for us, we have to basically adopt that, because unless we do that, we end up just like the Roman Empire, where we become our worst enemies and open the gates to the barbarians, which is the big threat that I worry about. Thank you.